So, how do you do sustainability? That's what we have to try and examine. And I've got the 4 approaches that, for me, bring some magic to the process of sustainability. So, sustainability as integration. The disciplinary skills that are provided through universities are generally in silos. And every government and every business has their different departments, and they don't often bring them together. When they do, you can get magic happening. But it doesn't happen easily. You actually have to learn together. We call that process policy learning, because each of them need to work out the language of the other and to see how they can help each other. And you have to adapt as you recognise that you don't have the whole answer. You need each other. And that process of policy learning is happening all over the place when you bring people together and you push them into an environment where they have to work together. That's the new era of learning that we're going through. Let me give you an example of how that happened with BHP Billiton in their choosing of a site for an LNG plant in Western Australia. They had a process of selecting sites which was dominated by their engineers. And they chose a particular island, Thevenard Island, and said there's no question that if you want to bring the Scarborough gas field to shore, then Thevenard Island will be the cheapest. So just go ahead with that. That was their recommendation to BHP. But BHP Billiton have a charter which is an overriding commitment to sustainability is built into it, where they say we want win-win-win solutions, not just win for the economic. So BHP, to their great credit, put aside that engineer solution and said, let's do a sustainability assessment. That's what they called it, which is not constrained by finances to begin with. We want to see what other options there are. They created space for learning, and they set aside a bit of money for it, and the environmental constraints were looked at, the socio-economic constraints, the physiographic constraints, and they put it all together, and they ended up with about 25 possible sites up and down the West Australian coast. And in particular, when they looked at the feasibility based on a whole range of other factors, they came down to 3 groups which were based around Burrup, Cape Preston and Onslow. They then went out and looked in detail at those 3 sites and began to talk to the stakeholders, the community. Communities around the Burrup were not so keen to have another development there. There was very little interest in the Cape Preston area, but in the Onslow area, where they had decided there was a potential site, the community were very strongly supportive. They felt as though economic development had bypassed their area, and they wanted to talk very carefully to BHP about the possibility of involvement. So they produced a multi-criteria analysis, the approach which essentially provides a full sustainability approach to the decision. And when they put it all together, they found that the Onslow sites came out best. Now, at that point, they then did the financial considerations. They looked again at the costs and found that the Onslow site was cheaper than the Thevenard Island site had been. So, in fact, they produced a win-win-win solution. They had strong community support, and they were able to proceed to the next stage confident that they had a much more sustainable outcome. So it was all round a very successful solution, but the key to it was that pause in their thinking where they were able to integrate a whole lot of other factors. That is the kind of magic that sustainability can bring to a decision-making process. The second approach is what I call sustainability as playing jazz. Now, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development is a collection of the world's biggest companies, and they have a headquarters in Switzerland. They have a very good website that looks at all kinds of issues to do with business and sustainable development. They did a study which looked at the future and said there were three approaches. The first one is FROG, first raise our growth. And that is the kind of Thatcherist approach which says make money, and out of that you might have something left to do a bit for the community and the environment. Not good enough, say the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Doesn't work anymore, probably never did. You've got to get more fundamental than that. The second approach they call geopolity, which is where you get large government intervention, you raise taxes and you top-down solve the problems. And they, naturally enough, don't like that either. They suggest there are just as many problems from government failure as market failure. And we certainly have plenty of examples of that. They suggest that the solution is jazz, and they call that the approach which brings together government, market and community and creates partnerships and synergies where there's flexibility. Now, the thing about jazz is that it's not that easy to do. Everybody likes it, but you've got to work at it, and you've also got a general direction of where you're going, but all kinds of innovation can be brought into it. People can lead at different times in surprising ways. At certain times you can get business setting the agenda and flying out in front and the others needing to catch up. Then you can get the community, then government. At different points, different players are involved, but in essence they're working together. And that kind of approach is what is sustainability is really all about, to be able to create those positions where opportunities where people can play music together. And that is an image that I think helps us a lot in sustainability. And one of the best examples that I discovered was from Argyle Diamonds, a company that began in the Kimberley to develop a diamond mine. It was a very controversial decision to develop there. The Aboriginal community in the area were told to have nothing to do with them. And for many years they worked away digging up their diamonds until a man came along, Brendan Hammond, who had worked in South Africa in the mining business. And the first thing he said when he got there was, how come local Indigenous people aren't working in this mine? And they couldn't really answer it. He said, well, it's going to change because we can't continue to go in this direction. And so they called a halt to what they were doing and said, let's think again about this whole operation. Why the heck are we doing this? And they called it a sustainability makeover. They had that pause in their operations, but they actually got together an approach which suggested that they needed to train Indigenous people to work in their mine. Otherwise, the legacy that they would leave would be just a big hole in the ground and a lot of money made that's gone elsewhere. They said their major legacy had to now become creating the skills in the local Indigenous community so that for generations they would be able to create their own work. Now, that was a very different approach, and the mining community at that time didn't really support it. It's not mainstream business for a mining company to become a developer of community values and community support systems. But they went down this track and they started training people in the processes of mining, people who had never worked who couldn't read and write in many cases, had police records, and they put them into a situation where they could train them and allow them to create an opportunity for themselves. What has happened at Argyle is remarkable. In a 5-year period, they've developed a workforce that is 27% Indigenous. Their goal is 40%. And the first foremen are coming through. It is remarkable to see on the site people working with sophisticated machinery who previously had never worked. Now that is a success story, and they have now raised the bar for the rest of the mining industry. So across the Pilbara and the Kimberley, the goldfields, you now find many companies attempting to go down this way. So there was a leader there. They were playing jazz in a way that nobody else had done, and they created a whole new approach, which is a far more sustainable one. I went to a signing ceremony with the local community to set up the Argyle Agreement, which would write into law the ability to continue this process for the Indigenous development. And there would have been 200 Indigenous people there. They did all kinds of traditional ceremonies, but every one of them I saw hugged Brendan Hammond. And I thought to myself, that's a very good new indicator we should have for CEOs in the workforce. How many hugs do you get from an Indigenous workforce? It was terrific to see. And that is a model, I think, of what a company can do to lead in sustainability. The third approach is about sustainability as setting a vision based on community values. And in many ways, the examples that I've so far given us also involve them. But in cities, we are constantly needing to raise the bar and suggest how we can become carbon-free, how we can save biodiversity, how we can use water less, how we can create communities that have ongoing identity and a sense of place. And you really can't do that unless you've got a strong linkage to community values. And that approach means that we have to think about our grandchildren. What is it that we are doing for them? I have a grandchild now, and when I look at her, I think, well, in 20 or 30 years, when she's an adult working on these issues, what's she going to say about what we did? And when you think that way, and you get people together looking at what they're doing and the issues of the day in that context, it does change things. Oregon in America has a community visioning approach which has been adopted now in many other places, and in Western Australia we've done similar things. It basically means you have to say, where are we now, where are we going, where do we want to be, and how do we get there? And that approach is pretty basic, but it is now happening in cities around the world. New York City is now showing terrific leadership in sustainability. They have a new plan, a 2030 sustainability plan that their mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, has put out there for the public. But he's done it with very powerful community engagement processes. They have helped to set the agenda. They have said, we want to show the world that we can reduce greenhouse gases 30% by 2030. We want to show that we can create affordable housing in a very wealthy city. We want to show that we can create neighbourhood spaces every few hundred metres for people to have and to recreate in. And that process is now occurring. So if there is no community space, they say, all right, we will need to buy some space, or we'll need to close off a road, create a park, but we'll need to do this with the community. So all over the city, they've got flowers growing as they begin this process of creating a long-term vision for their city. That whole process is the NYC 2030 is an example of establishing a community-based approach to the future. We did a similar one in Perth. We have a dialogue for the city process that occurred back in 2003, where 1,200 people were brought into one room and for 2 days worked on what it is they saw as the city of the future. They came up with 7 major conclusions: that they wanted strong local communities, a kind of city of villages. They needed a clean, green city, an urban growth boundary, a connected, multi-centred city, a city that had reduced car dependence, much better rail, local bike walk and integrated transport. They needed more diversity in housing, and they needed access to the city services for all. Now, in many ways, those are rather obvious statements, but they weren't actually driving the planning process at the time. They were far more sustainability oriented. And I believe that when you do touch community values, you can reach those kind of issues very, very much quicker. The final approach is to see sustainability as a set of step-by-step actions. You can't do sustainability by revolution. It has to be an evolving process, because we don't really know exactly how to do it. We have to play jazz, we have to create that policy learning opportunity, we have to involve the community. So it is a step-by-step approach, and each step, however, needs to be going somewhere. You have to see that it's heading down the track. An example of the step-by-step process is one that we were involved in as we helped to advise Multiplex developing an area called the Vale. Now, this was a fairly traditional suburban area which they began by building a lake and surrounding it by very green grass in order to try and show how wonderful this environment was. Unfortunately, the fertiliser leached through the grassed area and turned the lake green, which wasn't exactly what they wanted, have a smelly, algae-ridden lake as their symbol of the place. So we were brought in at that stage to say, well, you know, what can we do to make a better approach to sustainability? And certainly we could begin to show that they needed to do native plantings rather than these big grassy areas, and that this could be worked right through the whole complex. So they involved Josh Byrne, the Australian presenter on Gardening Australia, who works with companies to try and show how they can use native plants. And he ran a series of workshops and developed a set of guidelines so that when householders came there, they could develop their gardens using those guidelines. Multiplex provided a certain amount of money that could help with the landscaping. And these guidelines were fairly straightforward, and in all of the workshops, everybody said, that's great, we'll be part of that. The early days meant that the landscapers would come in and say, look, yeah, you've got these guidelines, but look, I can do this for you. And before long, they were rolling out the lawns and putting in the roses and doing a very traditional kind of landscaping. So it was failing because the contractors were not being brought on side. The workshops had to shift then to working with the landscapers and the contractors and showing them how to do it. And that began to change. And then slowly the combination of the attitudes of the families and the developer and the landscape contractors began to forge together. So what we've found now in the various stages of this development is that stage one had just 9% of the area with following the front yard native planting guidelines. Stage two got up to 13%, and stage 3 is now 40%. So at each stage of the development, they've got better at it. Now, I don't see that that could have been done any other way. It's nice to think that somehow or other a dramatic approach could have been taken and just by law insisting that this would happen. But it probably wouldn't have worked because people didn't know how to do it. So a step-by-step approach has achieved this now in the Vale, and hopefully it'll be 100% by stage 4, and that's the goal. So every one of the areas that we take on, whether it's saving biodiversity step by step, reducing our water use, reducing our energy use in the home, reducing our car use, they have to be taken in steps, and they have to be built into plans so that each year we can show how to overcome them. That's the approach that companies can use, as well as governments, as well as local communities. And I believe that at the end of the day, if these 4 approaches are taken, you will begin the process that can lead to a far more sustainable future.